Good evening. The School of Architecture public lecture series, run in association with the State Library of Queensland, this year is entitled North by Northwest, Local and Global Architectural Culture, under the broader umbrella of the Asia Pacific Design Library lecture series, which runs for the whole year. Our talks run in the first half of the year, drawing in architects and critics from our region and beyond to speak about their work and positioning in relation to the local and the global in a kind of sequential proximity. Again, we are collaborating with the University of Auckland to bring international speakers such as Jeffrey Inaba, who has collaborated with Rem Koolhaas in AMO and who now runs his own practice in Los Angeles, and will close the series. Hopefully, Go Hasegawa from Tokyo, and our thoughts are with the people of Japan and Tokyo tonight, alongside local practitioners such as Hamilton Wilson from Wilson Architects, who will speak next week, and M3 Architecture, and speakers drawn from across Australasia. Tonight's speaker, Anupama Kundu, graduated in 1989 from the University of Bombay and practiced as an independent architect in India, and since 1990 has produced a number of award-winning projects in which sustainable building technologies and infrastructural systems were developed as an integral part of the architecture. She completed her doctoral studies in 2008 at the University of Technology in Berlin, where she has also been teaching architecture and urban management. She has also taught at the AA in London and the University of Technology, Darmstadt, and has lectured and conducted workshops in several other institutions such as Cornell University, the American University at Beirut, University of Chiang Mai, the Royal Australian Institute of Architects, Sydney, School of Planning and Architecture at Delhi. She's entitled her talk tonight, Material Matters in Architecture. Could you please join with me in welcoming Anupama?
Thank you, John and Andrew, for inviting me here, and thank you all for coming. I would like to speak today about, like it says, material matters in architecture. I would like to discuss the materiality of the architecture that I have been involved in over the last 20 years in my practice. And of course, I want to also clarify that I don't feel so good when people write about my work and they talk only about this building technology and that, because that was never really the intention or obsession. And I still, today, I'm not actually obsessed with building materials and technologies. I've always seen architecture as the negative space that, like they say that the function of the pot lies in its nothingness. So I have always pursued architecture that way, and nevertheless, I also do believe that for a successful project, the materiality is an integral part of how that void is defined and held. And I have explored relationships between building materials and techniques and how they inform the design of the form itself. But I must also explain that I came from Bombay, and I've been raised in a high-density situation where problems are, very extreme with the numbers of people, and I have lived in that kind of chaotic situation of India where it's very rarely possible to think before acting. So there's a lot of construction happening without planning and a lot of very ad hoc, spontaneous kind of thing, because I've had the time to reflect during my academic years later, much later, that this is all part of the new urbanization that we are facing now, which is very different from the urbanization that had happened when Europe and America, 200 years ago were dealing with industrialization and all of that. And now what is happening is at a very unprecedented pace. So it's not just the chaos of the country in which I was raised, but the phenomena of urbanization is quite overwhelming. And I realize that a lot of cities are actually, now I can reflect, that they are merely populated. They are not necessarily inhabited. There's no time to actually make any cohesive kind of planning or whatever. And people are just moving in at such a pace in huge numbers. Nevertheless, I also realized that when I traveled out of Bombay, not wanting to do a conventional practice, which graduating out of school, I was very idealistic, and I just didn't want to succumb to the, any accepting just, managing to just have a job or whatever. So when I wandered around in rural India, I realized that India is actually very rural, even though everybody's talking about how cities are, population in cities have already overtaken villages. The fact is, like Mahatma Gandhi is very famous for having said that India lives in her villages. And this is something that is really quite appropriate, even though the numbers have overtaken, because you can't imagine that the mindset of people would overnight become urban. So when they move into cities, because they've just moved because of job opportunities, but they have the same conditions that they had. So they are not able to produce things in an urban manner. So for me, having roamed around in rural India, I realized that we have to find, even if we build cities or we build projects in cities, we are actually dealing with a rural mentality and rural conditions, and people cannot produce ultimately what we do in a neat manner. They have the skills that they have. If you ask them to do what other cities have done, you'll get an untidy job. But if you really go one layer below and see what they can do, what kind of materials are offered, you can come up with quite a satisfactory, acceptable solution. So I did not begin with any major ambition to come up with building technologies and all of that. But I just knew that we were already 20 years ago, we were aware of the environmental crisis that people acknowledge very widely now. It's a fact that if everybody has to have that standard which the developed countries have set in terms of consumption patterns, it's obvious that we are not going to be able to give everybody that. There's a huge social segregation, not only in the regions in India, but also in the world at large. And whatever we provide, even as green solutions, my opinion is that if a solution is not low cost, if it is not something that is for all, then it's not green. It cannot be green because you can measure things, make them all appear to be good, but only the elite a handful of people would do that. And how is it going to make any impact in the largest numbers of the global situation? So it's not going to be replicable. So with all of these different concerns in my mind, when I just had the first project, I was 23 years old when I was very lucky to have somebody, a French guy in India, asking me to do his house. And I had by then had managed, after Bombay, to live in a hut, live under thatch roofs, live in conditions where I realized that the problem was often created by the kind of architecture itself, that places were hotter than in the evenings, than the outside, and things like that. I realized I can't be giving those kind of solutions. So those kinds of concerns actually made me come up with the kind of responses that I did, which I'm going to show you. And I think because every time the problem had to be redefined, it brought out some other kind of technology, and ultimately people keep talking about all these technologies, but that is, I think, overrated. Nevertheless, I have been concerned with also socioeconomic realities and what building technologies how they would affect the larger picture, and whether every project I did, if that would be scalable and if it would be replicable, what would be the impact? I often thought that way, and that led to the kind of work I've done. I just wanted to mention one more thing about, I forgot what it was. It's okay? About the building technologies, yeah. That for me, innovation is not a frivolous thing. I don't think that like it has been said that there are so many real problems in the world. There's no need to invent things out of boredom or design to, as if you need some change for its own sake. I don't really believe in that. And if a solution is fine, I would not bother to, I would shift my attention to so many other real problems that require design solutions. I would like to summarize that my attempt in all of this building technologies that I'm going to show you, that I have developed to some extent, my attention was never on finding new materials, because often these new materials are the ones that are not low in embodied energy. They are all these manufactured materials which, I'm not so attracted to that. I have tried to use the same old materials in new ways, because sometimes due to our present times, one or another component cannot function like it did in our vernacular architecture. So I try to fix only that aspect, and I try to always try to appreciate what is there and try to make it still work, and not to just think of how to come up with another technology. It's very tiring to do that, and I'm quite a lazy person in that sense. I have tried to do things in order to be efficient. That has been mostly the driving force. I want to just show you some images about the chaos that I mentioned. So the first few slides are quite ugly. This is an example of how on the outskirts of Delhi, there's this city, Gurgaon, that is completely a planned situation. The way India is, advertising, they think, the perception is that suddenly we have the power to produce the kind of buildings that you have in Dubai, Singapore, anywhere in the world, and to be able to give this kind of infrastructure. But you see from this picture already in the surroundings, you see that this is what I mean by new urbanization happening at an unprecedented pace. I'm showing this image because Gurgaon has been recognized as the most unsustainable city. There's not enough water, power. The place is not even 30% realized, and a lot of corporate companies have rented spaces here, and there's a daily problem and a fight about basic resources. And you see the ground realities. You can see that pig roaming around. You can just see how rural actually the ground is. It's not really ready to receive this. So you see a very patchwork kind of situation. And I like this image a lot of the same city. This is all happening over the last 20 years or 10 years even. You can see, I don't know if this is a pointer. Anyway, you can see in the middle, there are 3 skylines. The middle skyline is the kind of small old town which was growing naturally, again organically, along a normal road where people added another floor to their shops and things like that. And, this was a normal, if the development wouldn't have, if a new town wasn't planned there, that is what would have happened at the rate at which India's casually urbanizing. This is the skyline. Behind it, you see the situation of the kind of buildings that I mentioned. And in the front here, while that other one is being built, here in the front you see the kind of slums that are simultaneously going to happen, because if you don't have these people coming in, then you can't build those things behind. So that's what I mean. It's always these people who are going to build those things. They are villagers. They don't have that kind of civic sense that that urban life requires. They have another one, and they are able to do different things, but they are being made to build those things. And the fact that India, with its diversity and a wide range of vernacular techniques that you find just a few kilometers away from each other, all of that has been lost very rapidly, and reinforced cement concrete has become the universal building material. You don't see any other technique being built at the moment. There's a severe steel and cement shortage because everybody needs the limited amount that India can produce. And I believe that a lot of these strong materials should be kept for those bridges and those very essential things, but you probably don't have to use it everywhere. Now each and every park bench and every railing in a temple is being built with the same material. And even people are using it for sculpture and for any kind of decoration and ornament, whatever, where you don't really need it. So I would say this has become a vernacular material actually now. So over the years, this is the most common technique. So I'm going to show you now, I've arranged it in this system because I wanted to go material and technology-wise and just describe the architecture through the way it had to be made and the influence of that on the form. This is the earliest project that I had built in 1990, and I had for that the climate is very similar to here, in probably more humid, and heavy monsoon. So the idea was to this and a lot of other projects are located in Auroville, an upcoming international city in South India, where the standards are quite high in terms of what the aspiration of the people, in terms of the international, standard of buildings that they would like to have. But as I said again, it's also set in a rural area, and people in that area have the skills they have. And I found out that potters in this area were losing their jobs and their livelihood because nobody wants those earthen pots anymore for cooking and all that. So I tried to use design catenary roofs to build the house, because tiles, ceramic has been used to such a great extent in roof building, for tiles and for so many other things, but they always require a substructure of wood, which we don't have anymore. So I tried to use the form to build these hollow tiles. We had to manufacture all these things specially for the purpose, but the idea was to get insulated roofs and to be able to use this labor that we had. We actually managed to, we wanted to include unskilled labor as well, so we got this partly thrown on the wheel, and partly there was a system where even an unskilled laborer would be able to taper it according to a mold. And we produced quite high quality components that we managed to have these roofs waterproof, and we had to develop a lot of things with first principles. I mean, I prefer to work in that way that everybody on the site, all the workers who are actually building it, they actually understand what is going on. Because if they understand what is going on rather than not understand, they are able to contribute. And they had a lot more experience than me, and they would tell me their ideas, and I was able, with their help, to solve the problems of building these ideas. And so I used to often make these kind of one-to-one things, explain them what's going on, and then hear from them. It was a very modern kind of house, and it was designed according to solar passive principles. And there are several materials here which I won't stress on, but we'll talk about it later. Like these louvers are made in ferrocement, which I'll talk about later because I think there's a lot of potential with that material. and cavity walls. And the architecture is quite modern, but many people call my work contemporary vernacular. I don't know what exactly, I mean, because of this, when they go inside these houses, then those images of vernacular, probably the kind of materiality again suggests something that they know, or there is this rustic kind of thing because of that handmade quality. So this is, it's a very large house with a professional-sized table tennis hall. Of course, the guy who was building this, he didn't like table tennis by the end of the house building. So we had to immediately convert. I knew about this problem before. I thought it will happen. But because it was obsessive to have such a huge scale combined with a residential scale. So I had put all these louvers to, always thinking of a backup, plan. And so eventually it was good that we had thought of that. And I want to also mention that I've taken the same climatic zone where, I'm just explaining according to the material then how the same climate would respond to a particular thing. So several other temporary structures or low impact buildings that we did. In fact, I lived in a house with the same kind of technique, was the exploration of round wood. Because a lot of times, timber is something that you'll have to wait for the tree to grow that big, then cut it into a rectangle. The same cross-section could have been achieved with a much younger tree, and also it would be stronger because the wood would be whole. Of course, there are a lot of disadvantages of this kind of method. It's not neat, it's untidy, and there's lots of space for bugs and lots of problems. But there's still something to explore for example, in this kind of ecotourism projects and places where you want to leave the place exactly how it was in case you want to ever dismantle these things. It's very easy, it's quite reasonable, and the granite pillars that we have mounted these buildings, the structures on, they are also just dug into the earth, and that's the reason why you can use pillars. Actually, if they would not be able to move, it wouldn't be a good idea to use stone. So the whole structure can move a little bit because everything is tied together with coconut rope. And so these buildings were built, a lot of people in Auroville, where I stayed, have actually been living in these kind of structures. And in fact, there is an Australian architect. I don't know his second name because in that place everybody calls everybody by first name because it's such a small place. So his name is Johnny. Sorry, it's so common. But I will ask him his second name next time for the next lecture. But he should, this is a lot of this is inspired by the work that he did, because he lives there since 40 years, and he built a lot of very playful structures, but also very stable structures using these kind of forms. And it was really a learning experience to see what people from different countries who had come and settled in this place, how they responded to the same situation. And the local architects feel like there's only one standard solution and one set of materials that you can use. So it was quite interesting. So this is the same kind of technique. This is the hut in which I lived for the first 10 years. And because I didn't have the money to build a house. And secondly, I realized that it's not easy to come up with a better solution. This had many disadvantages, but all the modern construction methods had also many disadvantages. So it required a lot of thinking before building one's own house. And there were some other structures where, again, timber is used, but the thatch that we use so many... I'll just go back to compare. The typical thatch roof is it is mounted in such a way that you require a lot of wood to mount it on. And in this kind of roofs, we've got a galvanized iron wire frame on which these things are mounted. So this is another example. This now is my own house, which I finally built after 10 years. And the reason I was able to build it is because I had gone to Germany after the war, and I had some work, and I wanted to use my money more than for a house to live in. I was not so sure about fully being here, but I wanted to have money to try out things where I felt like I didn't want my clients to be the guinea pig of some ideas, and I just felt like I would be able to do something without having to ask anybody, and I didn't put myself under any time pressure, and when I didn't like the solution, I could just wait, and I had no problem just waiting. I could also let the different laborers try out and make their mistakes somewhere, because they also need, if you try a new floor finish or whatever, you have to also give them time to develop those skills. But I didn't have any research budget throughout, and I just had to do it on the job, and there were certain things we couldn't do. So this is the house. It's a very narrow 2-meter 20 kind of interior space, which divides. This wall is actually to segregate the space which is more private at the back from the other side where there are many houses. And also the idea was to have very small spaces for myself and to have large social spaces, and the veranda space is about double of that. It's about 4.5 meters. So I lived alone, and I wanted to make sure that when I had visitors, I had enough space. But if I was on my own, I wouldn't have to face empty sofa sets and clean all kinds of things. So I just wanted a very minimal space for myself, and I wanted to open on either side and be able to just expand. So that was the idea. And in this, I have, in the section, by then a lot of students would come from everywhere and keep asking me for drawings and things. So I decided to make the elevations like sections so that they could just come and see the place and not ask me anything. And you could see all these, I started liking, actually, sections show how things work, and I liked them more than my own elevations often, and I started wherever possible, not trying to close that thing, but just show exactly how I dealt with the jagged edge, what have I done, and just to show that. And I realized that it was quite easy, I could just tell people, go and measure the thing, and how thick is the plaster and whatever. So that was the reason actually I did it. And in this house, I continued this roof many years later, because for the uppermost level, it was actually quite an efficient solution, and the price was also one of the most efficient, price-wise also. It was really fantastic. And here you see the layout. So there's that's a ground floor, and you see another guest bedroom, and this veranda space, and upstairs there is this axis. But spatially, when you experience the house, you see the other axis, actually feel more the other direction. So there are these long steps that go through and through the house onto the other side and raise the back part of the living area. And so it's a pity that nobody talks about those things, because they just come and talk about how the thing is made, mostly. And when you're in the bedroom, for example, you have this very other direction working. So you have a clear axis, you have a fully covered area jutting out with an alcove under a tree there. Then you have the semi-covered space, and then you have the open to sky and a little pool on the other end. So here is, it describes it a bit more. The interiors and exteriors are very fluid. And I've often worked with a couple of layers of windows so that you can regulate, because every window solution, at least in our climate there, it's either good for the monsoon or for the rest of the year. So it's better to have, I thought, to have two different things, and you just use them when you want them. And even these mosquito screens, they can be used for glare control, and so to segregate these things like a skin, and you actually manually open and use the one that you need in that season, because I think it's not really possible to have this one fixed thing. We also change our clothes according to the climate a little bit. So it makes, I think, the space more alive and also, again, more comfortable throughout the year. This is, the underneath space of the veranda. And there's this roof here, which you see, which I'm going to explain now. It's a filler slab. It's actually more efficient for large spans, but again, as I was trying a lot of things in my own house to do the larger application elsewhere, a lot of those things are actually put together, and it's a mixture of things. It's not done, many of those techniques are not for the house itself. So this again is for a very large hall that I wanted to try and let the people learn how to do this. The idea is that the thicker the slab or beam, the less steel you need to use, and because you thicken the depth, you need to again create voids to that's what a filler slab is, to make it lightweight. So often filler slabs and diagrid and all of these systems are not being used for large spans, because when you actually go to make it, there's a lot of form work and a lot of issues with actually fabricating it, and so it's not so convenient. So I'm moving out because I think some part of it is on my face. So I think it's important to try to sometimes, when a more efficient thing is not being used, to try to adapt it a little bit, that it becomes again easy to use. So I also found that in this area, people were they couldn't afford good quality shuttering and form work and so on. So they would usually use very bad planks and achieve an imperfect ceiling, and then they would have to have thick layers of plaster and paint and all of that. So I thought if I would give them a kind of adaptation of the filler slab, where the terracotta pots, which are the standard cooking pots, could be used as loss shuttering, then it would be quite efficient. So I used a mud plaster, to when you place these pots on the plank. I used a mud plaster so that you can just wash it off and then you get a smooth finish. But we used exactly those planks that they normally use. And this is an untidy picture. I don't have any, I often didn't document a lot of things I did. And I don't have another picture of this, but this was for a very organic form thing. But you can see here that you would skip 2 bars and every third is the one you use. So it's a lot more efficient in terms of steel consumption. And then this is the hall for which that ceiling was actually developed. And also through this efficient spans and sometimes inverted beams, I always try to have this kind of, in many of these community large span structures, you have all these beams and the hot air gets trapped in that area. So I try to always incorporate the climatic solution, the building construction, the structural design, and all of this in a happy synthesis that is also affordable. And when I first did this roof, it wasn't a low-cost housing project. It was for a regular client. And I was quite happy many years later when we were doing a very low-cost housing project where each house had to cost around $3,000, $3,000 or $4,000 only. And this was done about 8 years ago. So this is the price at which, again, when you find out that something you did, was relevant for a low-cost housing project, it's quite a good feeling, because you really wonder why low-cost solutions should only be for the poor. Why should something that costs less, why is there this segregation? Why, it should be beyond, materials at least should be beyond, that kind of a class system. But it is not free from that, so these solutions started getting applied in the region now. This is a bus shed, and it's being used easily, and those pots keep getting manufactured. Some people don't do a good job, and they taper it too much, and you need lots more pots. But anyway, yeah. I did one, by this stage, I started exploring also sustainable building infrastructure, and I wanted to work with a public building model as well as a housing project where I wanted by then to come up with figures that if water, energy, etc. were being met by a range of different sources, then after a few years, we would be able to monitor these consumption patterns and fine-tune what we had projected. So it was very important for me to try to take these things to the next scale. And also, a lot of people feel that these things cannot be used for the high-rise, but actually, the insulating layer is only needed on the uppermost floor. And those in-between slabs, they need anyway a different construction method. So basically, you can apply these in other ways, also for high-rise. And this is a project that this had also got an award because for the regular housing, within the regular housing demands, we had actually integrated a range of apartments. The outer design looks okay, but they look similar and repetitive, but inside there are very different kinds of apartments. And, some mezzanine studios and all sorts of things. And we were trying to solve the climatic aspect for ventilation. And we did a lot of it in rammed earth that we stabilized, which we had extracted out of the wastewater treatment plant. All the liquid from the sewage treatment plant was being reused and cleaned. So by then, a lot of my projects, in fact, most of them have all of these kind of, recycling plants. And my house also was fully powered by solar energy through solar thermal and photovoltaics. And the technology has improved now and also become more affordable. In this case, we tried to create like jack arches with the same insulation principle for the uppermost thing and for the rain. And for the hot air to go out, I had created streets on upper levels to create a community life in this housing project and detach them from these streets from the facade. Also because the hot air that can normally get trapped under a sunshade can also, you could increase the air stack for better ventilation. So those aspects have worked quite well in this project. And all of these are available industrially, but we still made them handmade and worked with those imperfections because of the reasons I explained earlier, because you don't need that quality for each and everything. Sometimes it's better to use a weaker brick for a weaker, when that strength is not necessary. So then it's possible to do a lot more things with local materials. So this is the roofing system here and the housing project. I'm not going to explain that, but there's a lot of reuse and recycling. I'm going to now show you the town hall complex, which was the public building that we had used as a prototype to, figure out again this kind of infrastructure issues. And before I come to that, I wanted to just show you a few images of the context. There's an urban plan for that area, which is very conceptual. As you can see, in 1968, this was founded, this city Auroville, it was designed by Roger Anger, a French architect, a Parisian architect who built over 100 high-rise apartments. I've written a book about him, which I'll mention again at the end. But it was located in his plan. And in 1968, a land which was so depleted and eroded at the coast, it's a coastal area situation where there was nothing happening and nothing growing. This has, canyons were formed with the topsoil flowing out. And such a degraded land had been reforested by those pioneer settlers, of which I mentioned Johnny was part. And these people have actually a history of and a very high aspiration for sustainable living, and they have had a big success with reforestation and other such issues. And over the last couple of years, I have been involved. Roger Angers actually had asked me to work on the city center, and I've done all the urban design for this area, and I did detailed plans with all this kind of new sustainable mobility and things like that, where we tried to create that every green corridors, that green networks that would enable people to not to have bicycles beside regular roads, but to have a complete alternative way to get home through bicycle and walking. So we had done that kind of, that was the context within which the administrative zone was planned with a habitat area behind, and this is all planned with a better density. And in this context, these buildings have been realized according to the urban design and some prototypes requirements that we had come up with, and about this interconnectedness and so on. And in this kind of scale, we have in this town hall complex, we have harvested rainwater from roofs, and we're treating it, and a mineral water company is actually distributing the water in the cafeteria, which is behind there. And so we've figured out now how to, for this climatic situation, how much to depend on rainwater, what we can do with the wastewater, and the kind of root zone treatments that are suitable for that area. So we are applying this in all our projects. I would like to enter this very kind of crazy kind of technique that has, it's still not resolved fully. It's still a technique that is in its infancy. Building with fire was a topic of my doctoral thesis, but I had also built some projects in this technique which involves mud houses that are built and fired after the whole thing is built to stabilize it. So Ray Meeker is the pioneer behind this. He built about 20 such buildings and perfected each and every obstacle that came up. The idea was that, I just want to explain, and it is possible to build, he had built some larger settlements also. The interesting thing for me was that the house, which is often seen as a consumer of building materials, could be seen also as a producer of building materials, and a complete different perspective could be acquired if such a thing would be built in places where people could self-build and they had the right kind of clay. The idea is that in a typical kiln, when you fire bricks or any other ceramic products, you lose about 40% of the heat into the walls of the kiln itself. And if that could be tapped by the house, and if the house, which is a mud house, would get fired as a consequence, it would lead to a lot of efficiency. This is, of course, easier said than done, because a large structure would crack. Even to do a large pot, it's complicated, but you would have to involve a lot of insulation, you have to bring the heat to reach the exterior and so on. But what is wonderful, and the potential of this technique, is that all these other ceramic materials that are used, pipes, toilet pans, wash basins, bricks, whatever, you can use gutters, water spouts, you can produce a lot of things within the house, and you could either sell it or you could finish your house with it. And recently, this technique for one of the projects I did, which I will just show you a few images of. It has been documented by the filmmaker Haroon Farooqui. The film was recently shown in MoMA. There are 12 other techniques. Zum Vergleich means in comparison. And he compared 12 techniques of brick making across the world in order to reflect on the social issues and show the diversity, because it's the first manufactured material, and it continues to be manufactured in almost the same way as it was 3,000 years ago, even now in the developing areas. and they are very sophisticated processes with robots and things. And he compares all of this situation in a very, very beautifully done film. And this project has been featured in that as well. And this is a home, like an orphanage that we did in Pondicherry. And this was built together with some students from different schools. We had, I often do these workshops that I take students and make them build a one-to-one thing so that they get a short experience with the materiality, and then they can go back to the design thing. And often it just means 10 days or 2 weeks or 3 weeks maximum, and they've learned a whole thing. They know how to supervise the site. They know how to visualize in the right scale. And they become more creative somehow by just involving their hands in the whole exercise. So here you see them stacking bricks. It's quite elaborate because at this stage it has to work as a kiln. By this stage, the experiment we did, we had used the coal dust that you can sweep out of floors in factories because they still have some calorific value. So we mixed some of that into the brick, about 5% in each brick. So each brick had a capacity to burn itself. So we had to light the fire. I don't want to get very technical, but it's a whole world of experiments, and there's still unresolved issues. This was from 2008. So the structure usually burns for 3 to 4 days, and it's quite an experience to have this. But it makes a huge difference when you bring fire to the building site rather than bring the same material to the industry to fire. The whole dynamics, the complete impact is totally different, and that's what I analyzed in my PhD thesis. So this is the way we had conceived of a project. We had to design the project in a way that it could be built by students in 3 weeks. So that was also one of the important, and that it could be filmed by these people. Because a lot of the things I did were not documented, so I started realizing the value of documenting in the last years. And even in this project and in many other areas, I often try to recycle and often source building materials not from the building industry, because often it's a lot cheaper. Secondly, there's a lot of junk that can be actually useful. For example, all the windows here cost $2 because they were like old bicycles. And at the same time, it was used as a formwork. We had also got that idea when we were on the spot there. And while we were building, the children were also reusing it instantly when they found it on the site. We had to tell them, please give us one, we need to make another window. So they had started playing with it. And the bathroom component was completely done with beer bottles. Actually, my aim was to gather medicine bottles because there's no much use for that, and they are stronger, smaller. And but we didn't manage to organize all of that. And then but I've often tried to use all of these craft-like things or things that you collect, but to try to use them structurally and not like a decoration, but try to use it as part of, to use these crafts in a way that it really contributes to the way the thing is built, and to the texture comes out of the way these things actually work to be able to hold the thing structurally. Like to finish those domes, I used regular teacups because they are way cheaper than glass blocks. And I just felt that since the whole thing is a vitrified product, and glass also is, it's good to finish with that. So we had built this. It looks very nice from inside. We had very little money, so we had often costs drive a lot of these decisions. And these were the pots again, storage things for the children. And here you see a bit of ferrocement in some areas, which to join a few of these domes. And now, before I end, I'm going to just quickly run through some of the teaching examples where students have the opportunity to discuss, to learn. This is the Hook Park area that the AA has acquired recently, and the project that the students had to do, a diploma project, was located here. And a short exercise, a hands-on exercise of 10 days had been plugged into this. This place, the Hook Park, had already a history of important people like Fray Otto and Richard Burton, who had actually worked and built a few round wood structures, the same things that I had also been exploring. And they had left some of these structures behind. And I actually like to use this as an example for the students, Andy Goldworthy's sculpture that is at the entrance gate. And you see the forest, it appears actually very straight. When you walk through, it looks very linear, but he's created a nest out of the same thing. And so when you see that, you can see the curves that are actually back there. And I find that this is a very good example of this form follows technology approach. And, students had were given this kind of, tool, like model boxes with everything in 1 to 50 scale. They had to just work with their hands and try to produce designs for a tower in a botanical garden, which we then, sorry, it's gone too fast. So we gave them 2 days to do this exercise, and then we had a jury, and we had people to help them and solve whatever was to be solved, and then evaluated it, and the best entry was built. So it was like, these are the kind of exercises, it takes just 10 days, and the students go back with a huge learning experience and have got their project built somehow. Ferrocement is another material that I'm still exploring and I'm still researching. This is a project of Roger Anger, and he's built 13-meter span roofs with this 2.5 centimeter material by folding. It's a material that gains strength the more you fold it, and so it's there's a lot of architectural potential which has not yet been fully tapped, I think. It has been mainly used for boat building, and Nervi has developed some kind of roofing panels within prefabricated beams that he used, but still people aren't using this enough. So these are some of the workshops that I do with students where they explore how these materials could lend themselves to architectural forms. And this is just to show you one of the areas that I'm now researching is about the tropical high-rise housing prototype, which I think also has been insufficiently addressed. Most of the high-rise buildings are the same all over the world, and the problem of ventilation and how to procure that in high-rise buildings. These are student works from a studio, which I've just started entering this area of research, and that's what I'm working with at the moment. This is the last thing I want to show you, because I don't know if this book is sufficiently enough available here, but I want to mention this publication that I recently authored, Research on Beauty by Roger Anger, and I would like to summarize again the material and the non-material coming together through the way I have even structured this work and this book, because as I explained, he had built a lot of projects, and he built the highest high-rise housing at that time in Grenoble in 1967, and he built a lot of things in India when he was a chief architect. And through all his work, you see the quest for beauty is not in a superficial way, it's a deeper thing, and it involves, he has done a lot of research on optical illusions, art, cubist principles, material research, and there are sections, so I have analyzed the relationship and how geometry can result in architectural elements and how they can take shape, how slight bends can lead to a different perception due to the light, and this kind of issues. And there's a whole chapter on material and his own material research. So there are all these materials with, ferrocement, for example, is something he used again as a structural material, a structural element which gave rise to that particular form. Yeah, I don't know what happened. I thought there was another last slide, but that was it. Thank you. Sorry, just one thing I want to tell you is that Louis just found out that his name is Johnny Allen.
Ah. I thought that was a babysitting issue. So.
No.
Would anyone like
Thank
to
you.
ask a question?
Hi. Just before I start, I really enjoyed your commentary on the climatic solutions that you've found for your in your architecture, because I don't think Brisbane appreciates enough its the subtropical climate and in relation to how Brisbane designs. So thanks very much. I just wondered if you could discuss the application of some of those low-tech solutions for the unskilled labour that you've had in larger scale applications, if they've worked on a commercial scale or in less sort of smaller architectural designs?
This was the commercial scale, but in the Indian context. I don't think that any of this should be applied all over the place, because I do think that that's why it's interesting in the context of the local global issue where this was placed. I had mentioned that I think that the awareness of the problems today are global, but the application should remain local, because no matter how much the lifestyle that is emerging today is in the same global direction, everywhere you can relate to how different people live, and the values are getting towards the same point. Still, there are issues of climate, geography, and socio-economic realities that are always going to be site-specific, and I wouldn't want to, by showing the things I've done in a certain context, I wouldn't want to try to suddenly apply it elsewhere. I would always try to redefine the problem if such a problem were given to me, and then I wouldn't impose any of these solutions on that new situation, you know. I don't know if I answered the question, but... I think the thing is that there is a big difference between the industrialized world and the one that is never going to be able to industrialize themselves in the way that they think they can, because it's too fast, it goes too fast. So I think we don't have to find a standard solution to any of this, but I do think that the industrialized world is sooner or later going to have to think about the embodied energy problem. Right now, I'm teaching in New York, and everybody tells me there, and we whenever we talk about sustainability and try to redefine all these assumed definitions, we find out that actually the developed world keeps telling you that materials is not the problem. We have to drop our energy bills and only reduce the run, because in the pie chart, the embodied energy is very small. But what they are starting to realize is that is because the other component is so high that it makes the embodied energy look so insignificant. But actually they are using very high energy materials, and yet they have a very small thing. But the moment they have started reducing, they're using efficient appliances, they're going for, solar panels and photovoltaic, all these kind of solutions, also high-tech. But because they get efficient, the other thing is revealing itself as a problem. So very soon, they'll have to start addressing reducing the embodied energy, and they're going to have to look into all this kind of ways of building. Maybe not to this extreme, end. Yeah, I agree with you, and actually that's the reason why I didn't document a lot of my things, because for me, the practice of architecture is a process rather than the product. The things I have undergone in the creating of the space, and it's going to keep changing with the users, and I don't want to photograph things and style everything, get all the people out of the way, and to publish. In fact, I have a lot of problem when things have to be published. In fact, in the last conference in Sydney, somebody, I forgot his name, he even wrote a piece on that. He told me that, can't you have better pictures? The work is good, but, And someone else mentioned how my drawings were, not like the kind of nice-looking things you can put in a magazine straight away. The thing is that I honestly can't be bothered to package it only for the sake of the glamour. I would love to have my office produce better drawings, but sometimes I have to employ people who can only do it that way. And I just don't want to, I really don't, my thrill is over when it's built, and and I know what it was, and I would love to have better photographs, but I think photography is great, but I think to think of architecture as just this kind of static images, I think it's a reduction of the architecture, and I don't think it's, I don't have the same feeling. I know everybody's doing it in our times. I don't think it used to be like that also some time ago. Very, very fast people are publishing their things without doing, things. And they all look almost similar also, the kind of images, even though the architecture is different. I don't know how. And because my pictures don't look like that, I have lots of problems, People ask me for that kind of pictures, and I just can't give it to them, and I don't know how to answer that, because that somehow reflects also people's values nowadays, and I don't, yeah.
We did a quick search in the library. I think there are 3 Ange books in Australia in libraries. So I can imagine after tonight that number will increase exponentially.
Okay.
So could you please join with me in thanking Amy Cummins?
Thank you all for coming. Just as a last note, I want to mention that in that book, those pictures are quite nice. It's like the architectural photography is really good. Okay.